Move my picture out of there. So this is the PowerPoint presentation that I've often lectured with in the past that I'm trying to get away from, but I'm going to cover it anyways to make sure at least I know that I feel like I've covered it then for you. Decision-making capabilities, that was on your worksheet, but it's basically the ability for the patient to make an informed decision. You've given them information, they're alert and oriented, and they have the ability to make a good decision on their part. We talked about the expressed consent. The person tells you, can be nonverbal. The slide picks up on that. That makes sense. They can shake their head yes. Informed consent, meaning you're telling them what you're going to do, you're explaining to them the risks and the benefits. Implied consent is the unconscious or incapacitated person, and then the involuntary consent is the minor or incarcerated person, things like that. Minors, we got to find the parents. If there's no parents, it is considered implied consent. No transport considerations become very difficult, especially when you don't think they need to go. There are things called in local parents, which means teachers, counselors, school officials, like the example I talked about going down to spring training where I had my son's friend with us with a piece of paper. Those people can make decisions for that minor in lieu of their parent. And then you have these emancipated minors under 18, but they've filed the proper paperwork and they are separated from their parents and they must be treated like an adult. I don't see that very often, but they're out there. If the situation is not urgent, you must get one of those types of consent. And the National Registry will certainly give you a scenario, a small paragraph of this is what happened, and they're going to say what type of consent, if any, did you acquire based on the information given to you. The right of refusal form. So this is a person who calls 911. You go there. They don't want to go to the hospital. They want you to, quote unquote, check me out. So you take their vital signs, you ask them some questions, maybe a blood sugar, things like that, and you go, everything looks pretty good. And they say, well, I don't want to go to the hospital. I just wanted to get checked out. Okay, so we're gonna fill out a right of refusal form, which basically says, I've educated you, I've informed you, and you do not want to go to the hospital. That's okay. But we also have these other forms. It's called the AMA form, or Against Medical Advice, AMA. And these are the people that say they're not going to go to the hospital, but you really think they need to go to the hospital. So you try to convince them through education. You try to convince them through informing them of the risks and the benefits. You recruit help. Nobody is better to get an old grandpa to the hospital than grandma. You get her involved and you watch how fast he steps through and decides to go along with you. But law enforcement is a good one. Calling medical control and saying, hey, I'm just an EMT, why don't you talk to a doctor, and let the doctor talk to him on the phone. Family and friends, all these different ways that you can help manipulate or convince that patient that they need to go to the hospital. And then I can't stress enough, you need to document the crap out of that. This is especially if they're not going to the hospital. This is what I have. This is where I think they should go. Here's all my assessment tools. These are all the people I talked to. This is, quote, what my patient told me that they did not want to go. We talked about the HIPAA laws. Who can we talk to? Other people on the EMS scene. We talked about mandatory reporting. You're allowed to give that HIPAA information to the third-party billing. And then there are times that you could potentially get subpoenaed into the court of law, in which case you can obviously share with the court as well. We talked about DNR. We talked about power medical attorney, living wills. Hospice cases. Hospice are people that are out there in their homes and no more further treatment is being required or requested by them. They just want to die peacefully. They want to die peacefully in their home. Sometimes it's days or hours. Other times it can be months or years, but they're on hospice care. Unfortunately, many times they call 911. Maybe the patient changes their mind. Maybe a family member changes their mind. Maybe it sounded like a really good idea until the pain got too bad. Maybe it sounded like a really good idea until you're right in your last couple hours and you're like, oh, wait a second, I don't want to die anymore. Becomes very difficult cases because in order to get a hospice care, you must be a DNR. But that brings up a good point. They're allowed to change their mind. If they signed a DNR paperwork and all of a sudden they say, I changed my mind, full treatment, we don't need another piece of paperwork. Their verbal statement of that is all we need. So we talked about no pulse, cool to the touch, asystole, so straight line. You guys don't have to worry about that as EMT basics. The rigor mortis, the pulling of the blood or the lividity, the purification of the body, and then obvious mortal trauma that the head is taken off. Something that one of the terminologies in the EMS world is trauma dead stays dead, which means if you are pulseless and non-breathing due to a traumatic event, it's very rare that you will somehow be revived or saved, whether it be in a hospital or in the field. Conversely, if you're having a medical event, heart attack, stroke, or some more that I want to come up with. If you're having a heart problem, if you're having a stroke problem, if you're having a breathing problem, if you're having a PE, pulmonary embolism, all those different things like that. If it's a medical problem and your pulseless and not breathing, these are the people that we could potentially save, whether it be through electrocution or some type of intervention. Trying to identify if they're an organ donor early is useful as well, because even though they're DNR or trauma dead stays dead, continue to do CPR on that patient may not bring them back to life, but it may keep the organs perfused long enough that they can be harvested and then donated if that's their wishes. Okay, so they're dead. They're dead. Now what? Well, you should have a protocol in place that tells you what to do. You need to get law enforcement there if they're not there already. Your job now shifts to the family and friends to console them, to show empathy, to help them understand and go through the grieving process. Law enforcement will come in and contact a coroner and make sure that process is taken care of. Your job is to make sure you're documenting what you did, what you didn't do, why for both of those events is important. Protecting the patient's integrity. Oftentimes, you'll cover them up with a sheet. Oftentimes, you'll let loved ones spend some time with the body before the coroner comes. These are typical things. Preserving any evidence. If there's any chance whatsoever that this is foul play, which if it's not in a hospital setting, there's always a very slight chance that it's foul play. We want to make sure that we preserve any type of evidence. So we're not going to be moving the body and allowing law enforcement screwing up their investigation, essentially. Here's a bunch of those mandatory reporting requirements we talked about. Suicide, dog bites. We didn't talk about dog bites. Rape we talked about. Drug-related injuries, not so much in the state of Wisconsin. But if you GSW's gunshot wound, stabbing, things like that, those are definitely mandatory reporting requirements. And then I had this whole little worksheet planned for you here where you could take all these terminologies and identify them. And we are not going to have the chance to do that. So I'm just going to go through here and see if any of these jump out at me for something that I have seen on the registry exec. Duty to act. So you do not have a duty to act right now because you're not an EMS provider. But once you get licensed, you have a duty to act, which means when they call 911, you can't go there and be like, never mind, I don't like that type of call. You have to do it. Our worksheet talked about, let's see if I brought that worksheet in here. The 4 things for gross negligence. Let me see if I can remember them off the top of my head. You have to have a duty to act. You had to act improperly. There's a term for it. Your improper action had to caused harm. And I'm blanking on the last one. I'll look it up and we'll talk about it next day. Assault and battery, knowing the difference between assault and battery. So you can verbally assault someone, but battery is when you actually put your hands on them. Kidnapping and false imprisonment. This happens, we're constantly walking that fine line in the EMS world between kidnapping and false imprisonment. So basically you're saying you need to go and they're saying I don't want to go, and you're trying to do your patient assessment to decide do I need to call law enforcement and chapter them? Are they alert and oriented? But in the meantime, they're just getting up and walking away. And you're trying to corral them to say, hey, just work with me here. I'm not law enforcement. I'm just trying to do what's best for you. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. Good Samaritan law. Not all states have a Good Samaritan law. The ones that do have it are going to cover the lay person from rendering care and possibly doing harm. But that sort of goes out the window for you once you get your certification. If you find a car crash on the side of the road and you're off duty and you stop, you're going to be acting underneath your license in a lot of ways. So if you went in there, went up to that car and did something very negligent and actually hurt that patient, the Good Samaritan law will most likely not cover you because you've had the training to know what and how to help that particular patient. The Good Samaritan law often helps people that don't have that training. What else do I want to talk about? We should have had one in here about abandonment. I don't see it. Oh, it is. It's way over there in the abandonment. This happens quite a bit at the hospitals. So you take your patient in out of your rig into the hospital, you put them in the room, and you get another call. Or the nurse doesn't come in, and you tell the patient, hey, stay here, I'm going to go get your nurse. And for whatever reason, you don't. And all of a sudden, 2 hours later, a nurse walks in the room and goes, when did you get here? Who are you? There's been no report. There's been no change of care. You abandoned that patient. You cannot do that. When I walk into the ER room, one of the first things I'll ask is, who's taking a report? I need to know who's taking over care, who's going to be in charge of this patient's care after I leave. And if that person's on the room, I'm not going to waste my breath telling anyone else because I'm going to have to repeat it for that particular patient. So I'm making sure I'm giving it to the right person. There's been several cases where there's a nurse's aide or even a janitor or someone in the room. You come in, you assume they're the person that's going to be taking over care, but in fact they have very little to no training. And you start rambling on about this is so-and-so coming from here, and this is what's wrong, blah, 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 and the person doesn't want to embarrass you, so they just smile and nod. And then you leave. You just abandoned your patient because that person is going to turn around and just sort of shrug their shoulders and walk out. They don't have a duty to act. You have a duty to act. Safe place for newborns. Firehouses and ambulance stations, there's a law that if someone gives birth to a child that they do not want or need to get rid of, it is a safe place for them to come and knock on your door and hand you the baby and say, this is my child, I'm abandoning it, I don't want it, and I don't know what else to do, so here, please find a good place for my child. And this has happened around the state of Wisconsin a handful of times. When that happens, you, or the person dropping it off, mom usually, does not have to give you any information. She has the right to simply hand you the baby and walk away. It's our job to get as much information as possible, in particular medical background. Is there a history of diabetes, mom's medical background, if we know who the father is, father's medical background. So even if we don't know anything about mom and dad's whereabouts or lifestyle or anything like that, at least we have some hereditary background medical information for that child moving forward. I think that's it. That's the majority of what we're going to talk about here for our medical and legal and ethical issues. So I think I was able to keep it pretty short. Look at that, under 15 minutes. That's good. I will see you guys